Believe it or not, some of the people who play D&D are a little nerdy. And as we all know, where nerds exist, so do hot takes. I'm no stranger to hot takes, and I have some of my own. And today we're going to have a look at some hot takes that I found on Reddit. And then I'm going to discuss my thoughts on them. These are my opinions only, and should not be taken an indictment of how people play, or should play, D&D. Every campaign needs to have a calendar to track time. This is something I always promise I'll do at the start of the campaign, but goddamn do I suck at it. And reading this reminded me that it's best to strike while the iron's hot, and get a calendar made right now. I couldn't agree more with this, especially if your campaign is affected by the passage of time, seasons, other things like that, then having a calendar can help make sure your world is always consistent. In the past, I've had to rewrite the whole history of the world to make sense of a random season change where my players clocked onto some inconsistencies. This take is certified valid. It will help so much in the long run if you make your calendar now and stick with it the whole way through your campaign. Your group can tell a compelling and intricate story with just the core rules, or even the 3 base rules. Everything else is just extra fluff. This take is interesting because I actually see so many different opinions on the core D&D rules. I have a bit to say about D&D's core rules myself. I think they're sufficient for telling a compelling story, and I think people overuse homebrew rules to change or add things that don't necessarily need to be different from how things are written in the original core rules. This is especially a problem when people don't have a good concept or grasp of the rules as is. The only caveat I want to raise is that the rules as written can be a bit ambiguous and needlessly restrictive sometimes. So DMs should have a bit of wriggle room to make sure things are cool and exciting. I feel like I often hear people say it's the DM's fault players start pulling up their phones or stop focusing on the game. That it's their job to keep them engaged. This mentality puts an unhealthy pressure on DMs, IMO. Especially if playing with friends, I think it's basic decency as a player to try being focused on the game. D&D is a group activity. You have all agreed to meet up and spend time together to play the game. Everyone knows the DM has to put in a lot of work and effort to make these games happen. Players should be respectful of that. This is, on the whole, a good take. DMs do put in proportionately a lot more work than players by the very nature of their role. Or at least they should do for a good game in 99% of cases. Out of respect for the time investment, the players need to be focused and not on their phones or preoccupied elsewhere. This solves so many problems of engagement, and this is not on the DM to solve. However, if multiple sessions in a row, or the general style of the game is boring or unengaging, players can't be entirely blamed for not being able to focus on the game. Of course, if you're unhappy with anything on either side of the DM screen, be grown up about it and talk. But if your games are boring, then people are going to get strayed and look at other things for entertainment. I've got ADHD, so I know what that's like sometimes. Sometimes it is, but 96% of the time it isn't. I have been a game where 2 players have a never-ending RP session that lasted 3.5 hours. The game was 4 hours long. The DM should have put a stop to it after 30 minutes or so. The day ended with 1 player playing Halo, 1 falling asleep, and 1 watching soccer. I'm lucky enough that I've never had this problem, and maybe sometimes it should fall on the DM to keep the game moving, but this is an extraordinary display of self-importance. The DM is the arbiter of the rules and the game world, but the players are also part of the group, and as a group of adults, most of the time, and probably friends, we should be able to monitor what we do and make sure that everyone is involved, and we're not wasting everybody's time by holding the spotlight. This does sound like the DM lost a bit of control over the table, but it shouldn't ever really get to this point in the first place. I think this person put a neat bow on how to navigate that, as a player and a DM. Yeah, that's mostly on the 2 players for bringing the game to a screeching halt. At any point, any of the other people in the room could have asked to move on, but nobody wants to be the one to say, "Can you 2 stop having fun, please?" As a player in the group, it's our job to moderate our own behaviour and be aware of how it's affecting the rest of the table. I'm in a game where my character tends to keep things moving, but I try not to just make decisions for the whole group or party. I try and always phrase it as, "Shall we do X?" to give the people the opportunity to chime in with other suggestions. I really like this. Taking ownership over the direction and pace of the game is something that players can do as well. It's not just the DM's job, good take. Stop hating on your DM for the way they portray a hostile NPC. Oh yeah, I've known the lines to get blurred between hating and being unkind to an NPC in character, and then saying genuinely hurtful things to your DM who is playing a character and holding a grudge against them in real life. This is one of those situations where DMs and players need to recognise the boundaries that exist in character and real life. And if they can't, it's probably worth finding a different group of people to play with. For example, if you're playing Strahd in character and doing villainous things well within the bounds of his character and personality, and then a player breaks character to shout in your face calling you all sorts of slurs, maybe the players should find some inner peace. This take is spot on. Villains exist, but remember the person who is playing them and keep it in character. In person is better than online. I started playing in person, moved online due to COVID, and then eventually had the opportunity to go back to in-person playing. This take is one that I 100% agree with. Of course, there are situations where playing in person is impossible, but if you ever have the chance, online cannot hold a candle to in-person D&D. It just hits different, and I don't think I could ever go back to playing online. Rule of cool is a detriment to the health of a game when it's ignoring clear and established rules, instead of being used to fill in the gaps between obscure rule interactions. As a DM, I mostly use Rule of Cool to keep the game flowing and roll with things that sound plausible. If a player asks if they can do something and I don't immediately know, I'll say yes / tell them to roll if it fits in the scope of what that character and ability are capable of, especially if it's good roleplay. But I'm not allowing any sort of clear misuse of how something should work for a really overpowered result. This is one of those times where the rules have caveats, and your group differs and blah blah blah. Rule of Cool is essentially another way of putting Rule 0. What the DM says goes. Framing it as the Rule of Cool can sometimes make the DM look like a bit of a douche for not allowing the player to do something way out of the bounds of the book. Because it's cool, Brad, don't you use the Rule of Cool? The other problem is, if you allow the Rule of Cool once, there's a risk of setting the precedent of that being the way the spell now works in your setting. Firebolt shouldn't be able to burn down a bridge, for example. A more helpful way of framing it is just saying it's Rule 0, and allowing your players to make suggestions that may stretch the bounds of the rules as written, but having the confidence to draw lines and boundaries. This is another thing that comes with time and experience, I think. So, get used to using the rules and playing your way. Evidently, this is an incredibly hot take. You can still have fun running a character with bad stats. I have a hot take. You can't have fun running a character with bad stats. A weakness is fun, but straight up bad stats is boring. I have to agree wholeheartedly with the second take. Stats are king in D&D, especially at later levels, and having bad stats blows chunks when it's practically impossible to succeed on numerous saving throws or ability checks that are going to come up in the late game. Unless you're playing D&D on pacifist mode, which is a perfectly valid way to play, by the way, you're going to have a bad time. A good parallel to draw would be in Baldur's Gate. Even with one dump stat, the amount of times you encounter that one thing, such as falling over on grease, being unable to jump up the tiniest gaps, getting charmed or otherwise CC'd, or failing every single face check. Those are things like persuasion, deception, etc. It just feels bad. Myself, I've only made charisma classes so far because I love the dialogue options, and having even slightly lower charisma would make me miserable. Now imagine have that for half of the majority of your stats. It's painful and boring. One or two bad stats can be fun for roleplay purposes, especially when your other stats that are there to bolster it. Another way around a glaring bunch of bad stats, especially for fate stats, would be the variant rule on page 175, making your skill checks use different stats depending on how the player has described their actions. The best example would be a barbarian using strength to intimidate townsfolk, rather than charisma, if they smashed a tankard into their face and crushed it, or using your knowledge of the history of the royal family to deceive the noble you're talking to, would be an intelligence rather than a charisma deception check. You get the gist. If it makes sense, you can argue for it. Having combat-focused campaigns is okay. I really enjoy intricate, strategy-based combat, and I spend 80% of the sessions I DM doing combat, and usually with 4th edition. Nowadays, playing like that is low-key considered the dark side of D&D. I totally respect and enjoy role-playing, but I do feel like many people are avoiding wargame style play like a plague. This is quite an interesting take, particularly considering D&D's history and roots as a dungeon crawler. But it's most definitely evolved from that, and the expectations people have of the game now tend to be more as a TTRPG, with emphasis on the roleplay aspect. Additionally, just rolling dice and dealing damage doesn't hold the same impact as it did 50 years ago. I agree that dungeon crawling is a huge part of D&D's history, present and future, but there are things that should be done to modernise it for today's audience. I'll make a whole video on it soon enough, but practice keeping your combat engaging, and you can definitely run D&D like a PvE wargame. Just make sure those expectations are set in session 0. D4 are the most painful dice to step on. Yep. Players should be saying what skill checks they'd like to roll and when. Players are not always able to cleanly convey in character what they're trying to use to accomplish what task. And while I as a DM reserve the right to change the necessary check, I welcome them potentially declaring what they're attempting to do out of character. I think this isn't a hot take per se, this is more just good practice as a player and DM. Clarity is always better than vagueness. And you should be able to trust your DM not to use their clarity information against you. This applies to the skill checks you're trying to do, but also in the ways you word your actions and checks. Saying, I punch the barkeeper is going to get a vastly different response to my character's flaw is that they hate being ripped off. Because the prices are so high for a room, I'm going to punch the barkeeper to cause a commotion to try and allow the rogue to steal a coin purse from one of the patrons. One looks like a simple, clean-cut case of being a murder hobo, and the other is a player doing something for the party's sake and role-playing their flaw. A bit of a tangent, but it gives you a bit of a picture of how specificity is key to good collaborative storytelling. Another key to making sure you can collaborate best at your table is ensuring that your characters match the setting of your campaign. Check out this video for my DM's guide to making D&D characters. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. See you next time.